June and August of 2017, two United States Navy destroyers, the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain, collided with commercial vessels in some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth, resulting in a combined total of 17 U.S. sailors' fatalities. When investigators reviewed what happened, they didn't find any equipment failure. They found crews who had been sleeping 4 to 5 hours a day for weeks with no structured rest schedule, operating on watch rotations that ran counter to their biological clocks. Trained, capable sailors lost situational awareness, missed warning signs, and lost control of their own steering systems. Not because they didn't care, but because their brains, after enough fragmented, mistimed sleep, simply stopped being able to do the job. The official safety statement on this kind of impairment is blunt. The cognitive degradation from sleep deprivation at this level is equivalent to alcohol intoxication. That's the stakes we're actually talking about, not a little sluggish. A version of your brain that performs like it's been drinking while you're stone sober. So if your recovery isn't working, this is why it matters. Let's get into it. Quick thing before we go further, because this is where most people make a critical mistake. When people realize they're tired, they usually focus on recovery, more sleep, more rest, more downtime. But some of the highest performing people in the world approach the problem completely differently. They don't just think about recovery, they think about energy management. In the next video, I broke down the psychology behind how elite performers and billionaires maintain energy despite carrying enormous workloads. And the answer is probably not what you'd expect. If you're interested in the mechanisms behind performance, fatigue, and why some people seem able to sustain focus for decades, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because that's the next layer beyond what we're covering here. For now, let's stay with recovery itself, because before you can manage energy effectively, you need to understand why recovery fails in the first place. Quick question. Have you ever pulled an all-nighter to study? Or stayed up late finishing something important and told yourself, I'll just catch up on sleep after? Here's the part nobody tells you. For one very specific type of recovery, that's not how it works. There's no after. Dr. Robert Stickgold, a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, has spent years studying what sleep does for memory and learning, and his research uncovered something that should change how you think about sleep loss entirely. If you learn something new, a skill, information, anything, and then you don't sleep properly that very first night afterward, the part of your brain that locks that memory into long-term storage never gets the chance to do its job, and it doesn't get a second chance later. In his studies, subjects learned a physical task, something as simple as typing a specific number sequence. Some of them were sleep-deprived on the first night after learning it. Then they were given 2 full nights of completely normal, recovered sleep afterward. You'd assume that's enough to catch up, right? It wasn't. The subjects who lost that first night never fully regained the skill improvement the well-rested group got. Not partially behind, permanently behind. Stickgold's blunt conclusion: repaying sleep debt is not possible when it comes to memory and learning. Here's why this matters and why it's bigger than memorizing a typing sequence. Late night sleep, specifically stage 2 NREM sleep, the stuff happening in the final hours before you wake up, is directly tied to performance gains. In some of these studies, late-stage sleep alone was responsible for a 15 to 20% boost in motor performance. That's the part of your sleep most people sacrifice first. Hitting snooze, cutting the morning short, getting up early to be productive. You're not just losing a bit of rest when you do that. You're cutting off the exact window your brain uses to finish consolidating what you learned and experienced the day before. And once that window closes, it's closed. But this is only part of the story, because the most common thing people do to fix exactly this kind of damage isn't just ineffective. It's making things actively worse. I want you to think about your own week for a second. Be honest. Do you sleep noticeably more on Saturday and Sunday than you do Monday through Friday? If you do, you're not alone. It's probably the single most universal recovery strategy on earth. Push hard all week, sleep in on the weekend, reset, repeat. It feels logical. It feels logical. It feels like balance. It is, according to the research, one of the worst things you can do to your metabolism. In 2019, Dr. Christopher Depner and Dr. Edward Melanson ran a controlled trial published in Current Biology that tested exactly this pattern. They took healthy adults and split them into 3 groups. One group got 9 hours of sleep a night. One group got restricted to 5 hours a night continuously. And the third group got 5 hours a night for 5 days, then unrestricted catch-up sleep over the weekend, then went straight back into 5-hour nights. That third group is literally how most people live their lives. Here's what happened to them. The continuous sleep restriction group, as expected, showed reduced insulin sensitivity, about 13%, along with weight gain. But the weekend recovery group, after their catch-up sleep and their return to restriction, their whole body, hepatic, and muscle insulin sensitivity dropped by 9 to 27%. In some measures, that's worse than just staying sleep-deprived the entire time. Let that sit for a second. The strategy that feels like the responsible thing to do, I'll make it up this weekend, was, in this controlled study, metabolically worse than not trying to recover at all. Why does this happen? Dr. Kenneth Wright, professor of integrative physiology at CU Boulder, explains the mechanism. Shifting your sleep schedule later on the weekend creates what's called social jet lag. Your central circadian clock, the master clock in your brain, starts adjusting to the new later weekend schedule. But your peripheral clocks, the ones running independently in your liver, your skeletal muscle, your fat tissue, don't shift at the same pace. They get desynchronized from each other. This is the part most people completely miss. It's not just tired Monday because I went to bed late Sunday. Your liver and your muscle tissue are now operating on conflicting internal timetables, which directly disrupts how your body processes glucose and manages energy. You're not recovering. You're inducing a kind of internal jet lag every single week voluntarily. This becomes even more important when you realize this isn't a one-off side effect. Researchers now have a name for it, the circadian yo-yo effect. Every weekend you do this, you're not banking sleep. You're putting your metabolic systems through a repeated cycle of desynchronization that actively impairs your ability to use energy efficiently, which, ironically, is the exact thing that makes you feel tired and sluggish in the first place. So if you've been doing this for years and wondering why resting never actually makes you feel rested, now you know. You've been treating a circadian problem like a math problem, and the body doesn't do math. It does rhythm. But here's where it gets even stranger. Even when this catch-up approach makes you feel a little better short-term, your actual brain might be telling you a different story than what's really happening underneath. Here's a question worth sitting with. How do you currently judge whether you're recovered? Be honest. It's probably just, do I feel okay? That instinct is the exact thing researchers have found you cannot trust. In 2021, Jeremy Ochab and a team of researchers ran a 21-day study published in PLOS One that tracked healthy adults continuously, actigraphy movement tracking, daily 64 electrode EEG brain scans, and a cognitive test called the Stroop test every single day. The protocol, 4 days of normal baseline, then 10 days of chronic partial sleep restriction, a 30% cut to their sleep need, followed by a full 7 days of completely unrestricted recovery sleep. A full week to bounce back. After that full week of recovery, here's what came back to normal. Reaction times on the Stroop test. That's it. Just raw speed. Here's what did not come back to baseline. Even after 7 full days of recovery sleep, cognitive accuracy, rest activity patterns, and the actual neurophysiological brainwave data from the EEG. Read that again. You can feel quicker. You can feel like you're back. And underneath that feeling, your brain's actual processing accuracy and its electrical activity patterns are still measurably damaged. Dr. Sean Drummond, professor of clinical neuroscience at Monash University, who studies fatigue in military and operational settings, has a term for this, a cumulative neurobehavioral deficit. His research shows that a single night of recovery sleep absolutely can make you feel less sleepy. But objective cognitive performance, attention, executive function, working memory can stay compromised for up to a full week afterward, and it takes sustained multiple consecutive nights of consolidated sleep to actually restore your baseline. This is the gap that explains so much confusion people have about their own tiredness. You sleep one good night after a rough stretch, you feel fine the next morning, you go right back to your normal pace of life, and you're operating on a brain that is still measurably not back to baseline. Subjective recovery races ahead of objective recovery, and we only ever check the subjective version because that's the only one we have access to without an EEG machine. What most people miss is this: feeling recovered is not the finish line. It's just the first system to come back online. The deeper systems, the ones running your actual cognitive accuracy, take far longer, and they're invisible to you while they're still broken. So, if your sleep duration and your sleep timing were both fine, but recovery still isn't holding, there's a structural piece left to look at, and has nothing to do with how many hours you were in bed. I want to challenge an assumption a lot of people carry around without ever questioning it, that I slept 8 hours and I recovered are the same statement. They're not even close to the same statement. Dr. Jonathan McFarland, a sleep medicine specialist, puts it about as plainly as it can be put. There is no such thing as repaying your debt when you don't get enough sleep. And crucially, he points out that someone can spend a full 8 hours in bed and still be effectively starved of deep, slow-wave sleep, because time in bed and time in restorative sleep stages are two completely different measurements. Here's the mechanism. Real recovery requires your brain to move sequentially through light sleep, into deep, slow-wave sleep, into REM, in organized cycles through the night. Deep, slow-wave sleep specifically is when your glymphatic system, think of it as your brain's waste clearance plumbing, runs at full capacity, flushing out metabolic byproducts that build up while you're awake and thinking. It's also when growth hormone surges, triggering tissue repair and cellular rebuilding. If your sleep is fragmented, even by tiny unconscious awakenings called microarousals, ones you'd never remember in the morning, that deep sleep gets constantly interrupted before it can finish its job. The cycle resets. The glymphatic clearance pump stalls before it clears the waste. You wake up after a full 8 hours, having technically slept, but never having gotten the deep stage repair your body actually needed. And this is where it gets genuinely unsettling. This glymphatic impairment can happen even in people who are not sleep deprived at all. You can hit your 8 hours, feel like you did everything right, and still wake up with brain fog, because your sleep was light and broken instead of deep and continuous, even though the clock says you got plenty. This is the mechanism behind something called non-restorative sleep syndrome, and it's also exactly why two people can sleep the identical number of hours and have wildly different outcomes the next day. One of them is getting actual recovery. The other is getting time in bed that looks like recovery from the outside and isn't. But this raises an obvious next question. If sleep architecture can be perfectly fine and you're still tired, what else is left? Turns out, some of the most common causes of unrelenting fatigue have nothing to do with sleep at all, and they're hiding in plain sight on tests you've probably already taken. In September 2016, a commuter train pulled into the Hoboken terminal in New Jersey. The approach speed limit was 10 miles per hour. The train hit the platform at over 21 miles per hour. One bystander died. More than 100 people were injured. The engineer didn't fall asleep at the wheel in any way he was aware of. He thought he kept a regular sleep schedule, but the federal investigation that followed found he had severe, completely undiagnosed obstructive sleep apnea, repeated collapses of his upper airway throughout the night, causing oxygen desaturation and hundreds of microarousals he never consciously registered. His brain never got the chance to enter deep, restorative sleep stages, night after night for who knows how long, because his own airway was repeatedly cutting it off. He wasn't ignoring his fatigue. He had no normal sleep architecture left to ignore. This is the part that should genuinely concern you. Obstructive sleep apnea is frequently missed, specifically in people who don't fit the stereotype, People who aren't significantly overweight and who don't have an obviously loud snoring pattern that a partner would notice and flag. It gets written off as ordinary daytime sleepiness, treated with more coffee or an earlier bedtime, while the actual mechanical obstruction continues every single night, undiagnosed. The fix, once correctly identified, is remarkably direct. Continuous positive airway pressure therapy, CPAP, keeps the airway open, eliminates the oxygen drops and the microarousals, and restores the sleep continuity your lymphatic system and growth hormone release actually need to function. This connects directly back to where we started this video. This isn't a theoretical mechanism. It's the same category of failure behind that train crash and behind those Navy collisions, a body that believes it's resting, sitting on top of a physiological process that's quietly preventing recovery from ever actually happening. So now we've covered sleep, circadian timing, nutrients, and airway obstruction. There's one more system left, and it might be the most common silent saboteur of all, because it can override every single other fix you make. Here's something worth asking yourself, honestly. Are you someone who, even lying in bed, exhausted, just can't seem to switch off? If so, your nervous system might be the actual blocker. Not your schedule, not your bedroom, not your blood work. Chronic stress keeps your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your HPA axis, persistently activated, which means sustained elevated cortisol and norepinephrine. Here's the direct conflict that creates. Cortisol is a built-in disruptor of slow-wave sleep. It's part of your body's alertness system. Asking your body to enter deep restorative sleep while cortisol is chronically elevated is asking two systems to do opposite things at the same time. The result is what's sometimes described as a flattened diurnal cortisol curve. Your morning cortisol, which is supposed to spike and help you feel naturally alert, comes in abnormally low. And your evening cortisol, which is supposed to taper off so you can wind down, stays abnormally high. You wake up groggy. You lie in bed wired. Both ends of your day are broken by the same underlying stress signal. And here's a discovery from the last few years that takes this even further. Recent transcriptomic research has found that chronic sleep restriction and stress-driven hyperarousal can actually alter the expression of microexons, tiny segments of genetic code responsible for how nervous system proteins are built. Disrupted splicing of these microexons in cortical neurons has been directly linked to persistent hyperarousal and chronic insomnia. What that actually means, in plain terms, in some chronically stressed, chronically tired people, the literal molecular machinery that's supposed to quiet down cortical activity and let the brain drop into deep sleep has been altered at a genetic level. It's not that they're failing to relax. The biological switch that produces relaxed deep sleep has been changed by the chronic stress itself. This is why just relax or just go to bed earlier can be genuinely useless advice for someone in this state. You can have flawless sleep timing, flawless sleep duration, full nutrient panels, and a clear airway and still not recover, because the nervous system itself is locked in an alert state that's incompatible with deep sleep. Which brings us to the final piece, and it's the one with the most consequential, recently overturned medical advice of everything we've covered. For decades, if you went to a doctor with unrelenting, unexplained fatigue, a very common piece of advice was to push through it, specifically structured exercise, known as graded exercise therapy, paired with cognitive behavioral therapy aimed at correcting what were assumed to be unhelpful illness beliefs. In October 2021, the UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence completely reversed that guidance for myalgic encephalomyelitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome. Graded exercise therapy was explicitly removed from the recommended treatments entirely. Cognitive behavioral therapy was reclassified, no longer positioned as a cure, only as supportive psychological care for living with the condition. Why the complete reversal? Because the central defining symptom of this condition is something called post-exertional malaise, where physical or cognitive exertion triggers a severe systemic energy crash that can last for days, sometimes weeks. For years, the medical default assumed patients just needed to push past deconditioning. The updated science recognized the opposite. In this condition, exertion itself damages the body's mitochondrial and metabolic recovery machinery. Pushing through isn't brave. It's actively harmful. Now, to be clear, this is the extreme end of the spectrum, and most people watching this are dealing with clinical ME/CFS, but the underlying principle scales down to everyone. At a certain point, willpower stops being the variable that determines whether you recover. Your physiology is the variable, and no amount of pushing through changes biology that's actively working against you. This is really the thread running through everything we just covered. Sleep debt that can't be repaid. Catch-up sleep that backfires. Brains that feel recovered before they actually are. 8 hours that aren't really 8 hours. Blood work that says normal while you're starving for iron. Airways failing you without a sound. Stress locks your nervous system out of deep sleep entirely. And at the far end, a body where exertion itself is the thing causing the damage. None of these are solved by trying harder at the one thing you've already been trying. You went to bed early. You slept in on the weekend. You did, genuinely, everything the common advice told you to do, and it didn't work. Not because you failed at recovery, but because recovery was never the single simple thing you were told it was. It's not one system. It's sleep architecture, circadian timing, metabolic stability, hormonal balance, and the absence of underlying physiological stressors, all running at once, all required, none of them optional. Fix the duration of your sleep and ignore the timing, and you're still stuck. Fix the timing and ignore your iron, and you're still stuck. The reason your recovery hasn't been working is that you've been treating a 5-system problem like a 1-variable equation. You came into this video expecting an explanation for why you're tired. What you're leaving with is something most people never get. The actual map of every place this can break, from a memory window that closes permanently to a weekend habit that's quietly working against your metabolism, to a brain that tells you you're fine before you actually are. Here's the one sentence I want you to leave with. Recovery isn't something you get more of. It's something you have to get right across every system at once, and now you know exactly where to look. If you finally understand why nothing's worked so far, that's not a small thing. That's the actual first step toward fixing it. And in the next video, I will break down the psychology behind how elite performers and billionaires maintain energy despite carrying enormous workloads. Make sure you subscribe to this channel.